It's House of Strauss. It's Joe Pompliano of the Huddle Up newsletter. Crushes topics of sports business. There is obviously some overlap in our spheres of interest, and Joe often does stories that are really in depth and very much business oriented. One of these is how ESPN Bet appears to have been a bad bet. And I'm really interested in what appears to be a massive financial failure in what was theoretically the future. So we are going to unpack all of that, riff on all of that, and bounce some other topics off of Joe, such as why ESPN is divesting from the MLB when it is investing in the NBA. And also I want to look at whether Tom Brady's run as an announcer was a disaster or was it something else? So these are the topics on your mental side scroll if we were doing a PTI show. Actually, we might even be able to bounce off the whole around the horn going kaput. We go any direction with Joe. It's the beauty of it. But let's start with your fantastic story on your newsletter. What happened with this whole mess of Barstool, ESPN, Penn, the gambling? Why didn't it work? And what are the repercussions of that?
I mean, I don't even know where to start, right? Like if you think about ESPN Bet, a few years ago when this was launched, I wrote a piece and I basically just called it a Hail Mary. And the reason why I called it a Hail Mary was because I don't know how Penn CEO Jay Snowden convinced his board of directors, to leave Barstool and go do this with ESPN, right? And if you think about it, they had done this deal with Barstool, and many people at the time said this was genius, right? You're going to partner with Barstool, this hip, younger company that had this huge fan base that was super passionate, and that was going to be their way to steal market share away from FanDuel and DraftKings, who really were just spending a ton of money to acquire customers, right? Like that was their entryway. They would just spend more money than everyone else when a new state came live and they would acquire a bunch of customers. So you had to think outside the box. And it seemed like a good idea, but it just didn't work. Several years in, they barely had any market share. They were spending a ton of money. So they went and they basically spun it by saying, Barstool is a net negative to our brand. Regulators don't want them associated with gambling. They're breaking a bunch of rules. We can't get approved in new states. We have to divest this partnership. We're going to sell it back to Dave Portnoy for $1, which, okay, sure. There's a clause in the contract reportedly that says that if Portnoy goes and sells it again, then they get a piece of it. Great. Awesome. He says he's not going to do that. But the worst part is that they wrote a non-compete that was so poorly written that Barstool was able to sign a new sportsbook deal with DraftKings right after the following football season. So not only did they make a lot of that money back now, if you're Dave Portnoy, but you're also stealing a bunch of the customers back that you gave to Penn in the first place, right? Like you partnered with Barstool. If you're a Barstool fan and Dave Portnoy tells you to go make a bet, and it used to be on ESPN Bet or Penn at the time, and now he says we're with DraftKings, you're probably just moving to DraftKings, right? So I think that was one of the bigger blunders. But if you look at ESPN, it's just very clearly not working, right? We're almost in year 3 of this. They have just over 2% of the market share, where if you add up DraftKings and FanDuel, those two companies still have over 70% of the market share combined. The business, it's a little hard to separate because they combine it with some other stuff too, but that side of the business lost $110 million last quarter alone. So they're not making any money on this. They're losing quite a lot of money, actually. It's not working. They just integrated the app or the sports betting application into ESPN's mobile app. So it's been sort of slow to move. And look, ESPN and Penn will tell you that a lot of this is going to rely on their new flagship streaming service that's going to come out in the fall. But it's very clearly not working much further ahead of that, right? Like if you look at the market share today, they claim that they were going to have 20% market share by 2027. You're sitting at just over 2% today. That's very far off. And in my estimation, they're probably not going to get anywhere close to that over the next few years. And as I wrote in the piece, which we can get into, there's an opt-out coming up here in 2026. So ESPN Penn can walk away from this deal if it's not working, which my guess is if they stay around this 2-3%, that's probably going to happen.
Do you think part of the problem is that ESPN, for whatever reason, isn't a good gambling conduit? That maybe this worked in theory, that this is the biggest sports company. And so if you partner with gambling, you'll get people, you'll funnel them, you'll get sports fans to gamble. But for whatever reason, podcasts have just been more of a conduit. And there's almost something to this idea of whether it's Dave Portnoy, whether it's Bill Simmons, it's almost like the customer has to trust you and like you to lose money because of you and to keep doing it. Or am I reading it wrong?
No, I think you're right. But, it's not just ESPN, right? If you think about ESPN is they buy sports rights and they broadcast them. I think that to your point around the horn and some of the other shows that they've done, a lot of that has lost influence over the years, whereas podcasts have become more popular. And that's a great way to go acquire customers. I think more so, though, it speaks to all these other strategies just aren't working, right? Like you have to come into the market if you want to steal market share from DraftKings and FanDuel, and you have to try something else. And we've seen a couple different approaches. Partnering with ESPN to form ESPN Bet and doing it through media rights and their content engine is certainly one avenue that a lot of people thought might work. It's not working. The other side of this is if you look at Fanatics, right? Fanatics launched a sports book and they came out and they said, we have 100 million emails on our email list because of all the people who bought sports merchandise through us. We can offer jerseys and other collectibles and things like that as rewards. That's really not working either. Maybe a little bit too early to tell, but certainly not working as well. So what else is left? The only thing that I've seen work to some degree is like building these daily fantasy products, right? And if you think about sports betting in general, FanDuel and DraftKings started with daily fantasy sports before sports betting was legal. Then they moved to sports betting because that was more profitable. But all they're really trying to do is push you to iGaming, right? Which is like slots and card games and things like that, because the profit margins are even better. So they want you to bet on sports, but they really want you to do iGaming. Whereas daily fantasy sports are now looking at this, companies like Underdog, Sleeper, Prize Picks, things like that. And they're saying, okay, we'll just go build great daily fantasy sports products. And then maybe eventually we can convince you to go into sports betting. So they're almost starting like one level lower. That's what I think Penn should have done, because those are actually good businesses. I mean, these are billion-dollar businesses that are making money rather than losing money. And even if they don't transition people into sports betting, at least they have a legitimate business to fall back on. Whereas Penn kind of just went for the jugular and it's not working. And to your point, I think ESPN as a partner is not great in the way that they're doing it, but I also don't think ESPN has been a great partner. Like, do me a favor and just turn on ESPN one day. You have no idea that they're even partnered with ESPN Bet. They were running ads for DraftKings and Caesars for a period of time after they initially signed the deal to finish out those contracts. But I wrote this in the piece. Most people don't even know this, but they own 4% of DraftKings. Disney does, right? So like they still have upside whether ESPN Bet works or not. I think really what this was they wanted to offset some of the decline that they had seen on the cable side and monetize sports betting. And if you're ESPN, you're going to get paid $150 million to basically be an exclusive partner with Penn and ESPN Bet. Great. That sounds awesome. We're going to get paid that. We have $500 million in warrants if this thing works out. Awesome. That sounds good too. But regardless, we're going to lock up $150 million a year, which is double what DraftKings and Caesars were paying us. That sounds fantastic. And we don't really care if it works or not.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And this is an interesting topic I hear about behind the scenes, which is how good of a partner is your partner. And I hear sports media commentators grousing about it sometimes. So they go, well, that guy got paid a bunch or whatever media mogul with DraftKings or FanDuel or whatever, and he just barely talks about it. He just pocketed the money. Now, I'm sure they try to work certain things in to the contract, but I was hearing that with McAfee before some of his more formalized deals with ESPN, that he had signed these deals and not really been a voice marketing it. It seems like it's is it a Wild West? I don't even know what to call it when it comes to this space, this new industry, that, if you could call it that, and not everybody plays fair or does what their partners want after signing the deals. And it's not like you're going to feel too guilty about it because you're sort of selling the modern day equivalent of cigarettes. So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think they care, but also, one, I think you're right. I've heard this about a number of people within sports media, not even with sports betting, but other things as well. The type of partner is super important because a lot of these, these podcasts and these shows and things like that, they have so many different partners where you're all sort of fighting for attention, which makes it sort of difficult. But I just think in Penn's case, like they thought that they were just going to be able to attach their name to ESPN, put it on some of the shows as commercials and things like that, and then leverage their personalities, whether it's Scott Van Pelt or people like that, Stephen A., et cetera. And it was going to be popular. And I think what we've seen now is that that stuff really doesn't matter anymore, right?
No.
Like those people have less influence than you think. And it's now trending much stronger in the direction of the podcast people and things like that. And look, DraftKings and FanDuel, I don't think that, I'm not going to sit here and say that they have the best technology in the world and the best products, but they've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in this stuff at this point. They have thousands of employees that work on the marketing team, but also the technology team that set the lines, et cetera. They know what they're doing. They've optimized this thing and made it as efficient as possible. So just using a celebrity endorsement like a Stephen A or something like that isn't going to accomplish it, especially when you sit there and you look at the incentives and you're like, okay, ESPN, they don't need this to succeed. They really don't care. Whereas Penn really does. I mean, you've already failed one partnership. You sold the company back to Dave Portnoy, but more importantly, you wrote down like a $600 or $700 million loss on the deal. Now you're going to commit a few $100 million more to ESPN. It's just, it's one of those things where I can't believe the board let them do it, but it's going to be more interesting if they just cut ties after 3 years and say, okay, we gave it another effort. Let's just get out of this altogether.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think about what direction to take this particular mess, this particular conversation. Where does it leave Barstool? What do you think is their trajectory when it comes to this whole I guess what I'm trying to get my arms around right now is just, where does this go? Does this stop at any particular place? They really are trying to get in so many of these spaces, the parlay betting, as you mentioned in your article, this whole, that's how you make your money. People don't, just as a service announcement to everybody, parlays are fun. They don't work out for you as well as maybe some of the other bets. The other bets might be a little bit more like blackjack. The parlays might be a little bit more like slots or whatever. Do you see, I guess, a top of the market? Have we reached the top of the market when it comes to sports gambling, or is there still more there?
No, I don't even think we're close. I think it's going to get so much worse. I really do. And look, you know this, I don't think you are either, but I'm not a huge fan of it. I think that, it's fine, right? Like it's fine. If you want to bet on sports, I have absolutely no problem with that at all. I don't think it's something though that we should be putting on every single broadcast. It should be integrated within every single podcast and everything else like that. But my more concern is to your point around what types of gambling people are doing, right? If you want to draft a daily fantasy sports lineup or do a straight bet on a game, like I think that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But what you'll see is that, FanDuel has pumped hundreds of millions of dollars into advertising specifically around these same game parlays. They really broadcast that everywhere, and they tell all of their influencers and their contractual employees to do the exact same thing. And the reason they do that, to your point, is because they're 3 to 4 times more profitable than a straight bet. The hold on those things is just incredible relative to what they would normally get on a straight bet. So it's a great way to increase their profit margins as a company. And going back to making things more efficient, this is how they do it. But where does that stop, right? To your point. Yeah. They're going to try to get as many people as they can as more states legalize this stuff to bet on games. Then they're going to continue to push them into parlays because that's more profitable. They're going to create new products that are even more profitable probably than parlays. But to my earlier point, I really think it all leads to this sort of dystopian society where everyone is gambling on a wide range of things, right? You see that Polymarket exists, Kalshi exists, where you can bet on politics. You can bet on whether, I saw the other day there were odds for Trump's congressional address, whether he was going to say certain words a number of times. Literally, you're going to be able to bet on everything, whether it is slots or things like that, but also to, how likely something is going to happen. And I think the unfortunate part is those products lend themselves really well to society today and probably even more so in the future. And it's going to be really hard to stop that train when it gets going.
Some of those are so strange to me because somebody knows the answer to that question before it happens. With sports, you don't know, the teams themselves don't know who's going to win and by what amount of points. With something like how often in a speech somebody says something, or I remember watching the Super Bowl and looking at the odds of what is the first song Rihanna is going to use a year or two ago. And I thought about, what would be good bets on that? And then she started out with Bitch Better Have My Money, which I wouldn't have expected to be in the Super Bowl rotation with all of America watching. But I believe that was the first song. Yeah. And I thought, somebody knows that. I mean, how do you even assure a lack of corruption there or a lack of people behind the scenes doing a self-dealing on that. And I agree with you that there is something dystopian about all aspects of entertainment life becoming this commodified bet, to say nothing of the issue I'm identifying, which is that somebody knows the answer even before it happens.
Well, it's not even sports betting, right? It's essentially everything. Like, I don't know if you saw this the other day when Trump tweeted and he said that he's going to establish this crypto reserve with Bitcoin and a bunch of these other assets. Someone had levered long and made like $200 million by buying Bitcoin like 12 hours before that happened, or some of the other assets, right? And we don't know who it is. But did they know something? Maybe, because then they went short the other side of it when it got announced that it was when some of the tariffs got applied and other things like that, right? So they made money both ways. And to your point, someone knows the answer to that. And I think that is sort of the confusing part here, because there's really nothing stopping anyone from doing that. It's almost like it's like legalized corruption. And it's not that it's, I don't necessarily think it was Trump that did it, but maybe it was someone involved in the committee to implement those rules, or maybe it was someone else, but someone knew that something was going to be happening. And it happens in stocks, it happens in crypto, it happens in sports betting. And it's sort of a way where they broadcast those stories, right? Like, I saw that on Twitter, but it gets broadcast out because it's so outrageous. And then it convinces other people to go gamble on these things as well. So it's sort of like marketing for the industry in this sidestep way where, none of these regulations, even if you were to implement them, would really matter, because there's always going to be someone who's making money on this stuff. And when you broadcast those wins, like a DraftKings or a FanDuel always does, when someone bets $1 and wins 1,000, that is going to convince people who aren't as maybe intellectually strong to go bet on these things.
Sophisticated is the euphemism we'll go with there. I mean, what sports gambling doesn't have is what poker had when I was in college. Poker had this great word of mouth, online poker did, where I had friends who were legitimately making money, who were really making money off it. And then that made you want to do it. And most of the people who did probably were suckers or lost money. And I had other friends who then lost money, and then they had to nervously call their parents about how they'd lost however many thousands of dollars. You don't really hear that with sports gambling. I know of professional sports gamblers. I know they spend more money spend more time getting bets down than they do trying to get an edge. But socially, you don't really hear people going, man, I'm just making a killing. You might hear I'm hot. You don't hear people saying that because, as we have said time and time again in this podcast, it is a carnival game. It's set up for you to lose. Once you start racking up the bets, like our guy Ryan Glass-Steagall of now Front Office Sports, you get locked out of the accounts, and it doesn't take a lot of money for that to happen. And that's one of the reasons why I wonder if there's diminishing returns at a certain point, because even if you're getting it broadcast to you, oh my God, look, this person won so much money after making a bet. Nobody in your own life is telling you that. Maybe I'm too optimistic to think that matters at all.
No, I think it matters less than you think. There's the amount of people who are spending like legitimate time and have an edge on this stuff is so small compared to the total number of people that are betting. And there's going to be people, like, addiction is a real thing, right? Like, addiction is a real thing where you're going to have people that are seriously addicted to betting and will lose whatever amount of money it takes. And what we've seen is that not only will they cut you off if you're winning, but they're going to facilitate your losses, right? And what I mean by that is, there was this story, I forget exactly where it was. It might have been in the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal a while ago. I remember reading it, maybe even a year ago at this point. But it was specifically speaking about one of the big sports betting operators. And it was saying how they basically had this VIP team to take care of all their high-level customers, which isn't news to anyone else. But what they were doing were basically contacting these people nonstop, giving them free bets, giving them incentives, taking them to games. And these weren't winning bettors, right? These weren't whales with a ton of money. These were people who live in $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 houses that can't afford to lose money, but were racking up hundreds of thousands of dollars of losses without their significant other knowing, right? And we're talking like divorce at that point. We're talking about losing your house at that point, like just terrible, terrible things. But again, these sports betting companies don't necessarily care, right? There's rules and regulations in place to protect some of these things for sure, but they don't always get applied and they don't always matter. And I think what we're going to see over time is that stuff is just going to become more prevalent. Like there's certainly, There's certainly bettors that are going to lose, $10, $20. You're in college. You just want to bet on a game with your buddies and have fun. Like, I think that stuff is the good side, if we can call it that, of sports betting. But as you get older and you start to have more income and maybe your risk tolerance is higher than the average person, that stuff goes out the window. And that's where FanDuel, DraftKings, et cetera, they like to find those people. And those are the people that are holding up their business.
Yeah, you mentioned the with your buddies. I think that's the component. I'm not a prude about this. I'm not anti-gambling in any instance. I went to Las Vegas for, I think it might have been the divisional round of the NFL playoffs with some college friends, and we went to the sports book and we placed bets, and I think we lost more than we won. We might have done a few stupid parlays. But that's fine. That's like a fun time. And if we had won, then that's a fun time. And we lost, and it wasn't a huge amount of money that we lost. It's an experience. I think there are a lot of things like that where socially they're even maybe good. They're not a negative. It's a sort of vice where socially it's fine. Yeah. But if it becomes a personal thing, I think drugs are a little bit like this. Maybe that's controversial. I think getting together with your friends and doing a kind of drug, we don't have to specify the kind of drug, that can be a fun time. The problem is when you're doing it privately in order to relieve whatever's going on in your life. That's why I found the Eric Andre ad for, I can't remember if it was DraftKings or FanDuel, but the comedian Eric Andre did this ad where it's a guy by himself in a dark apartment. And Eric Andre is this little voice who's popping up, whether it's in his refrigerator or freezer, telling him to bet on the Bills. And when I saw that, I went, yeah, that's not good. That's not good. That's not good. It used to be they were promoting the idea that it was one big party and you were going to, like a fantasy draft with your buddies, win all this money, get the attention of girls. And now it's transitioned to, hey, you know what you should do when you're by yourself in your apartment? You should do this. That right there, that's when I went, yeah, I don't know. And I bring this stuff up. I like to talk freely about it. I think that I'm able to because of how I'm positioned, and you are because of how you're positioned. But I've noticed, too, my friends in the industry who get money from this, who get money from these advertisers, I don't think I'm all that judgmental about it. And I have even said that if I was working for The Athletic or whatever, I would be part of this and that would be part of my job and I wouldn't quit over it. But they get so sensitive about it, Joe. I don't know if you've encountered that at all, where they get touchy about it and they go.
Well, it's because of their inability to talk about it. They believe. My feeling is that they often believe, and I don't even know who you're specifically talking about, but I've encountered a lot of the same things. And my experience is that in a lot of instances, they believe and feel the exact same things that we're talking about here, but don't have the ability to talk about them publicly, right? Like in some instances, promoting a sports book or a game, they're not even betting themselves, right? And it sort of feels like icky to a degree, right? Like you're like, okay, sure, this is part of the job. I'm making money. It's an ad. People can determine what they want to do. Fine, sure. I think that's understood. But if you're not betting on sports yourself and you're going to tell other people to bet on sports, hey, here's my parlay for the weekend that I'm not actually going to bet on myself. I'm getting credits from the sports book and they're going to go promote this. Like, okay, yeah, that starts to cross the line a little bit. And to your point around our ability to talk about it, I think that's been helpful to all of us, right? Because we can go out and say exactly what we believe about these things, which in a lot of instances I think is correct. Because if you look at basically every facet of professional sports now is coming under the gun because people are looking at media rights and they're saying, we just don't know what's going to happen, right? Like the NBA, no one thought Adam Silver was going to be able to get that deal, but that deal may not exist when this deal's up, right? Like we just don't know what the landscape's going to look like. So if that revenue starts to bottom out, which we've seen former owners who have recently sold their team talk about, other people in sports have talked about a lot, where does the revenue come from? Okay, sure, we can go do real estate projects and build the Battery in Atlanta or Ballpark Village in St. Louis or Patriot Place in New England and make some money that way. But where else is it going to come from? It's going to come from sports betting, not only at the team level, but the league level too. And obviously at the broadcast level as well, when you talk about ESPN Bet and the deal they've done there. So if every single person in sports, the players because of their salaries, the media businesses, whether it's the broadcast, but also the podcasters discussing the sports, if sports betting has infiltrated every single aspect of professional sports and they're the one that are financing everything, you have to be quiet about it, right? You can't not talk about it. The only reason that we're able to talk about it is because our businesses are funded by readers and subscribers and fans of the stuff that we write and talk about. Whereas all the other people have an incentive to keep these things going because that's how they're making money. And I think it's this weird scenario now where when is that going to change, or will it ever change? It's certainly not going to be changing in the next few years as more states come alive because, there's a subset of the population that has access to it today. But if California goes live, if Texas goes live, if it starts to expand in Florida, like that opens up a whole new thing where it's only going to get more popular as an aspect of sports.
Yeah, I have a term for this, fracking the pie, where when you can't grow the pie, you got to frack the pie. Just like how they're not going to discover a new Permian basin in Texas, so you've got to be able to shoot water underground and pull more oil and more. I don't actually know how that business works, but you've got to pull more stuff out of the ground that you exchange for money. However you do that, it's like that. They're not going to get just a radically different base of fans for these sports in the United States. Football is probably about as popular as it's ever going to be. Basketball is getting less popular. Baseball, which we will talk about, less popular. Even if we might say that its troubles are overrated, it's getting less popular. The only way you can really keep making money for these businesses who have an embedded growth principle, these rising team valuations, is to dig deeper and deeper and deeper into the fans' pocket. And so that's part of what's happening. And I think a lot of people who are engaged in that process feel uncomfortable with it. It's hard. People want to feel like the good guy. And maybe I can compartmentalize in that way. And if I was making money this way, I could look in the mirror and I could say to myself, look, this is just what I got to do. It's not great, but I got to feed my family. It's how it is. And these are consenting adults who are making these bets. I'm not going to feel too bad about it. I think for some other people, though, it's just hard to reconcile it all. And they need to, that's why they get touchy. That's why some of my friends, multiple friends, get very touchy about it. It's also why I've got my own reluctance. I have people reach out to me sometimes who want to partner with me. And those could be good opportunities. But if I'm in the sports media space, I'm always looking at it and I'm going, I don't know how to do a partnership in which I'm making you money and I'm not pushing this stuff. And I don't want to be dealing with pushing this stuff because I have the luxury not to have to do it. I just don't see a way for me to join somebody else's product that's not subscription based and avoid being part of this onslaught.
Well, the other thing that doesn't get discussed nearly enough is the legalization aspect of this when we talk about how bad it's going to get. And there's an interesting angle that I was actually talking about this with Will Kane the other day. And we were talking about the states that have legalized sports betting, right? And if you think about New York specifically, Steve Cohen right now is trying to build an $8 billion entertainment district around Citi Field in New York City and in Queens. And he's basically just going to take the parking lot, build garages so people park there instead, and then turn the parking lot, the asphalt parking lot, into this thing. And it's going to have a hotel, a casino, a sports book, restaurants, all that kind of stuff. He's privately financing all $8 billion of the project himself in combination with Hard Rock International, the casino business. Now, why is he doing that? He's doing it because he thinks he's going to make a lot of money doing that. He'll say the fan experience, all that kind of stuff, but he wants to make money. That's very clear. But why is New York going to allow that? Well, he's going to pay a ton of money for one of the licenses for a casino around New York City. But more importantly, New York City, when it comes to sports betting and New York in general, they get a 50% tax on all the money that the operators make, right? So you're going to look at states across the board that have yet to legalize them, like a New York who waited a while but has now legalized it. And states that have problems with budgeting, they're going to go enact sports betting laws, and they're going to put them in place because it's an easy and a cheap way, sort of like the lottery, to be able to tax your residents a higher rate than you currently are. And it's going to help out with budgeting and things like that. But it's also a growing pie because we know that it's becoming more popular, and the sports books are going to allow you to do it because, look, let's think about it this way. If you're getting charged a 50% tax and you're still deciding to operate and spend a ton of money on marketing in that state, how much money are you making? You're making a ton of money, obviously, right? You're making so much money that you're able to give 50% of it back to the state in a tax. So it's obviously incredibly lucrative for the sports books, but also the states. And I think at some point, California, it seems unlikely that they're going to legalize sports betting. They've just been super against it in the past in certain instances. But if you start thinking about budgetary concerns, it becomes much more likely because it's an easy and a cheap way to get much more tax revenue in the door than anything else that you could go do.
Yeah, it becomes a regressive tax that your residents choose. It becomes a way to tax people who are usually in the lower part of the bracket and do so in a way that's sneaky. And I don't love it. But
it's like the lottery. It's like the lottery.
Yeah. And I don't love that, but it's the law. And it's really challenged some of my intuitions about what the law should be, because I am generally in favor of letting adults do what they want to do and having the freedom to do it. But I'm confronted with how some freedoms seem to corrupt the people's ability to have even free will, that there's actually not a societal benefit to letting people do fentanyl, to letting them have that freedom. You can say it's a slippery slope if you are draconian with that you'll start not letting people do other things that maybe aren't so bad. I don't know, but I've seen it. And I'm just a big believer. This is my political ethos more than anything else. I call it, how did that work out ism. That's my philosophy. That's one of my main philosophies, because a lot of people have their idea in their heads of how society should be run. And then when they get what they want and it goes bad, they'll cling to it and they'll say, well, it wasn't implemented right, whatever. I just go, look, I was more liberal in the small L version of the word when it comes to drug legalization. And then I've seen what has happened in this country and in San Francisco. I reevaluate some things. I don't know if we're completely there with sports betting because a lot of it's underneath the surface and you don't know. People are very much ashamed when they're losing money and they don't broadcast it all. But I've got my eye on it.
I wonder if some of this, though, is like self-serving. I think about this a lot on my side, right? Because I was the same way you were with drugs, with sports betting at the beginning, right? Like I had that same approach, which was let people do what they want. If they want to bet on sports, totally okay with it. It doesn't impact my life at all. And now I'm sort of the opposite, where I'm like, okay, this is very clearly a net negative to society. Whether you want to say like, okay, go allow people to do it. I think it's a net negative, but where do you draw that line? I get the argument. But my whole problem with it now is like, is me saying this just self-serving because I don't particularly enjoy betting on sports, right? Like maybe if I loved betting on sports, I would argue the other way. I don't know. I'd like to think that I would still understand that it's probably a net negative and that's why I don't do it. But I could see why people who do enjoy gambling on sports are like, they want access to it.
I enjoy betting on sports, but I'm also lazy and I don't have time to necessarily jump through the digital hoops to do it. And
see, I'm the opposite. I don't like how I watch games when I bet on sports.
See, that's interesting. I did a picks column in 2019 for NBA. I want to test my NBA knowledge, and an agent called me up and he said, "Man, you've lost your love of the game." And I thought there was something insightful about it. I still love basketball, but something had shifted with me where it just didn't mean the same thing. The Warriors had won a few championships. I'd gone to 100 games a year, and I was getting a little bit older, and I just didn't feel the same way about who wins, who loses, and devoting my entire life to what just happened. And so I was looking for a little bit more juice. And that agent, he sussed that out, that I was trying to almost gin up interest in myself that wasn't there in the first place. So yeah, there's something to that. But I look at sports gambling a little bit like I look at video games or playing Madden. In another life where I had infinite time, I would love to just get high and play Madden. That would be great. Yeah. but I've got a family and I've got my own business. I just don't have time for that. That's how I feel about sports betting. But a lot of younger men, a lot of single men, they got time. They've got time and they're bored. And so this is an avenue for it.
I like that. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. And because the reason why I assume it's probably similar to the feeling you have when you go to that many games in a year, right? Like I don't go to 100 games a year. I just don't like the fact that, I'll turn on a random game. And if I bet on that random game, all of a sudden I'm just watching the game in a completely different way. Yeah. Where I'm like, okay, I'm starting to argue with the refs through my TV because I don't like a call that's going to impact the bet. When in reality, like, maybe it was a fine call. I don't know, right? It just, it totally impacts the way that you watch the game because you're obviously rooting for one side versus the other. Whereas traditionally I would just turn on a game because I genuinely like the sport. Like I was watching it as a teenager. And I think, that's probably not a net positive anyways, even if it does, add a little bit of juice to the broadcast for the leagues and everyone else.
It's funny because you get plugged into the matrix of the other people who are watching it for that reason that you didn't know. Because when I started doing the picks column, I started to notice the other people, even in the audience, who were watching the games like I was watching them. I had an experience of making a pick, and I think the line was some double-digit line. It was supposed to be a blowout, and it might have been, I don't know, it might have been an 11-point line. And the losing side team, when I think his team might have been losing by, I don't know, 12 points, and the time is ticking down, and he lazily just lofts up a 40-foot shot, and it goes in at the buzzer, meaningless to the ultimate outcome. And I just felt this pain, and I just and then I looked at the replay of it, and I saw two other guys in the audience reacting with just this chagrin and disgust. And I went, oh, those are my people. They did what I did. They made that pick. They're on that wavelength. And so it is this whole other way of watching the game that isn't completely aligned with the spirit of the game that you want to be focusing on. But we gotta rush through because I've got a heart out as much as I could talk about all of this forever. Dealer's choice. Do you want to go ESPN divesting from baseball and why baseball is worth so much less than basketball? Or do you want to go with, was Tom Brady a disaster as an announcer or something else? Which one do you want to go with first?
Let's do them both. We'll do it quick though. And we'll start with, let's do ESPN because we can do that one real quick. And baseball. Okay. I just think that ESPN thought it was a bad deal. I think baseball, like if you think about it, what works on a national level with ESPN?
Let's set the parameters, because I think what's interesting is the comparison, which is the money difference between the NBA amount ESPN is paying out versus what was the baseball option. So can we set that up and then breeze through it with your takes?
Yeah. So essentially, ESPN decided that they didn't want to pay $550 million a year for Major League Baseball. They had a previous deal that they were paying even more. They were broadcasting 90 games a year. In 2021, that went down to 30 games per year. So they were already kind of inching their way out of the baseball business. And then they looked at it and they said, okay, we're only paying like $150 million less than Fox, but Fox gets the World Series, the League Championship Series, the League Division Series. They get the Field of Dreams game. They get all this other stuff in addition to the regular season package. So you're looking at it and you're like, okay, this is just a really bad deal. Our business is already declining in value. Like, why are we doing this? So they went to Rob Manfred and they said, look, we want to lower our fee, or we want more inventory. There's not a ton more inventory to give out, so he can't do that. He doesn't want to lower their fee because that makes the business less money. So then now he's going to go out and try to get more money from someone else and sell his package. But saying they mutually agreed to part ways was hilarious to me because the mutual agree was we're out, and baseball said, okay, that sucks. See you later. Right. There was nothing mutual about this. ESPN didn't want to do it and they had an opt out and they canceled it. But
that reminds me of the Norm Macdonald on SNL after he'd been fired 2 years earlier, where he said to the audience, and I can't do Norm's impeccable delivery, but it was this, we had a disagreement. I still wanted to work here. And it turned out they felt the exact opposite way. So it was one of those, but continue.
That's exactly what happened though, right? And sure, look, Rob Manfred did the smart thing, which was he spun it in his letter to MLB owners, which conveniently got leaked immediately when it was sent, saying ESPN is a bad partner. They don't ever talk about baseball. Their business is declining. We want to go find someone else. And I literally saw baseball fans all over Twitter saying, this is awesome, huge W for Manfred. Like, he did the right thing. ESPN sucks. And like, sure, some of that is true. They certainly don't talk about baseball. They talk about football and basketball, and that's what their network is. But at the same time, like, this says a lot about baseball too, where you can't even get your current partners who signed a deal to stick around because the sport isn't growing like it used to be. And I think to that point is that baseball is just a regional sport, right? And every sport is sort of regional to a degree, but certain sports have national aspects to it, right? In football, it's the quarterback discussion. In basketball, it's LeBron James. There are certain national aspects that you can discuss on that level that transcend different regions. Baseball doesn't have that, right? Like, sure, Shohei Ohtani maybe, but that's more international than it is national here. The average sports fan in America still doesn't really care about Ohtani. I'm sorry, but they just don't. The Yankees, Red Sox used to be like that, but it's not really like that anymore. And ESPN wants national things, and baseball just really isn't like that anymore. Basketball gives you a ton of inventory, sort of like baseball, but it's still national to a degree because of some of the culture stuff going on there. And I think ESPN just said, we don't want to do that anymore. See you later.
Yeah, I think part of me believes that if baseball was emphasized, it could be different. That if ESPN approached it and gave it its publicity and tried to harness this Ohtani thing, tried to harness what the Yankees are, now what the Mets are increasingly, they could almost set the agenda, but they're not going to take that risk. And I think they believe in the downward trajectory of baseball. They believe that it's getting grayer and just more relevant. And they don't talk about it nationally. And I feel both ways about it. I feel in a way that baseball is underrated as a national commodity. Many people in our industry wouldn't know that the World Series is more watched than the NBA Finals in recent years. But at the same time, for whatever reason, as you've said, there's a regionality to it, and it doesn't work if you're on a sports talk show and they're talking about baseball. It just doesn't. And that is the reality. I actually, before we get to the Tom Brady thing, I've got a take on Around the Horn. I've heard some things about it. And do you think that's more of a structural issue? Those sorts of shows don't work anymore? Or do you think they went about it the wrong way? Because I know my take on it when I would see the panels and the panelists, with some exceptions. I think if you're writing for Outkick the Coverage, you would say woke. And I don't think you'd be entirely wrong. I would say this much. The collection of people on that show were often not a collection of people who were speaking to the median sports fan. I would include myself as such a person just because I'm more of an effete nerd. You know, I'm not Pat McAfee is what I would say, or one of these personalities that would obviously resonate with the median sports fan. It almost seemed as though Around the Horn, even after the vibe shift that we keep referring to, was still of this Earth 2 where the vibe shift never happened. And I have to believe that undermined the ability to retain an audience. It looked like they were almost a caricature of characters who would annoy average sports fans. So that's my take.
I 100% agree. Look, I'm not surprised that the reaction was what it was. People love nostalgia, and it's just one of those shows that has been around forever. And people are obviously going to talk about that as in like, oh, I can't believe they're getting rid of this, whatever. But I don't like the show. I don't know. Like, I used to like it back in the day. I haven't really enjoyed it so much over the last, 5 or 10 years, maybe. I respect it, right? Anytime you put on a show for that long, obviously a lot of work goes into it. But the idea that it was this massively popular show is just not accurate, right? ESPN is not in the business of getting rid of shows that people actually watch and enjoy. So the data is clearly telling them that the show wasn't nearly as popular as some of the people online seem to think it was. And to your point, I agree. I think in a lot of instances, the debates became focused on groupthink, right? And it was just like, who can agree on a lot of these things? versus what people actually want to hear, which is debate and disagreement and people being a little bit more edgy with their personal opinions. And I think that really got eliminated over the last, 5 years. Whereas the show in the past was like direct debate between people with opposing viewpoints, certainly less woke or whatever you want to call it culturally. But that didn't really matter back in the day. It was just specifically about sports. And that debate was what people enjoyed relative to today, where it seems like when you turn on the show, everyone was kind of just like agreeing with each other, which is not what people want to watch.
And I've heard they tried to get other personalities on the show to actually have some friction, and they avoided it. I think there were people on that show who would definitely hold that mantle and argue with some of the groupthink of the millennial blogger journalist types who had been upgraded to TV personality. Frank Isola, who's been on this show, is one of those who I don't think would be shy about it. But I don't know if there's this institutional tolerance for that kind of disagreement and that sort of debate. And especially from, I think, the more millennial, yes, for lack of a better word, liberal woke side. I don't think there's that ability to say, hey, we've got different perspectives. Let's have it out. Let's have an argument. I think it was a show that did, in a way, retreat into a bubble, even if it was ostensibly theoretically about debate.
But think about what shows are successful on sports television today. You can almost determine what's successful by what you're seeing on clips on social media, right? Like you don't have to tune into the show. It really just depends on how many clips you're seeing. That's like the easiest way to determine the success of a show. When is the last time you saw someone on Twitter clip a segment from Around the Horn? It just doesn't happen, right?
No.
But you'll get that from Get Up. Yeah. You'll get that from First Take. You'll get that from Pat McAfee's show. You'll get that from Fox on a bunch of shows, Colin Cowherd, etc. Whereas you don't really get that from Around the Horn, and certainly not SportsCenter or any of those other shows anymore.
I mean, there's just not that institutional tolerance for being what maybe that show could be. I remember I was surprised when Pat McAfee reacted to the boxer. Was it Iman Khalif? I cannot remember the name exactly. That whole controversy that doesn't need to be recapitulated, where it would seem the boxer was male but had a DSD and whatever. McAfee had a certain perspective that I think is in line with what most sports fans, if not most people, would say and react with. And my immediate reaction when seeing it is, oh, you just would not see that really hashed out on Around the Horn, in good faith at least. You wouldn't see it like, look, this is what I think, this is what you think. And if it
why do you think that show specifically? Because ESPN is obviously willing to do it on other shows.
Well, McAfee is too big to fail. Right? They can't say anything about, they can't tell him they've tried, and he's basically beat his chest and said, I'll do whatever and I'll quit. And they more or less, I think, have bent the knee to him versus the other way around. But I think that the producers of that show had enough juice to protect their space and make it what they wanted it to be. But what I'm saying is it could have occupied a cool space. Some would say keep politics out. I understand that. It's a little difficult if sports overlaps with politics and you're having a debate show. But what I like about, let's say, Real Time with Bill Maher, which people can think this or that about Bill Maher, but that's one of the rare places where people with different viewpoints will actually have it out and fight. Yeah. You just don't see that. And there just wasn't the tolerance for that on
wait
ESPN.
Until they cancel PTI, and then you'll really see an uproar of people on social media.
Oh, yeah. Well, PTI is a little like The Simpsons, where I'm sure, I'm not saying it's bad. I mean, The Simpsons got bad. I'm sure it's still good with Tony and Wilbon, but sometimes I go, oh, that's still going. Oh my God, it's still going.
Well, they like rarely come in the studio anymore. I think it certainly feels like it's on its last leg.
Yeah, it's okay. So let's hit the whole Brady thing. A lot of different viewpoints on it. I guess I'm wondering, is the Brady thing going to continue? I should have researched this properly. But
I have. We're talking about opposing viewpoints. I have a different opinion on this than I think everyone else in sports media. I think the Brady deal is a good deal. I think it's a good deal.
I like it. I think
it's a good deal.
Tell me why.
I think it's a great deal. So the reason why everyone thinks it's a bad deal is because they're paying him so much money for worse performance in the booth than Greg Olsen, right? Like if you just think about those things, he's making more money than anyone else, but he's probably not as good. That's an opinion, but he's probably not as good, which seems to be the popular opinion. I don't necessarily have that opinion. I think he's fine. Look, I thought Greg Olsen was amazing, actually. I really liked Greg Olsen in the booth.
Yeah.
So to live up to that is really difficult. He's probably not there, but I don't think he's terrible like some people think. The reason why I think it's a good deal, though, is because he's not being paid to be a broadcaster. That's not what they're paying him for, right? They're paying to be associated with Tom Brady. So he gets $37.5 million a year. I do think he's going to continue it because that's a lot of money. It's more money than he made playing professional football for 20 years. It's a hell of a lot of money, especially when he wants to take on all these other challenges with the Raiders and everything else. He has a lot of interest outside of sports. From an investment perspective, $37.5 million will help you there. So I do think he'll continue. But for Fox, I think it's a good deal because if you think about how much money they're spending on sports in general, right? We can talk about the cable business for hours. That business is obviously declining. So what do you have to do? You have to keep that business going for as long as you can because it's actually a really good business if it stayed in its current format. If you stop losing subscribers and people stop churning on cable. If you're Fox and you're investing billions of dollars every single year into sports rights across the NFL, but also a ton of other sports as well. And then you think about Brady and you're going to pay him $37.5 million, which is when you add everything up, less than 1% of what you're going to spend on everything else. But you're going to tell him you're not only going to be a broadcaster. You're going to star in commercials for IndyCar. You're going to show up for the Michigan-Ohio State game and do a guest appearance. You're going to hand out the championship trophy for the UFL. You're going to, show up for this secondary sports property and elevate it and make it a little bit more popular. And by the way, you're also going to go out to dinner and you're going to play golf with these media executives that are potentially going to advertise on our network as well. And you're going to convince them to go do that. All of a sudden it starts making a lot more sense, right? Like, I think some people have the expectation that Fox thought that, like, to me, the naive opinion is that Fox thought Brady was going to increase viewership for the NFL and they were going to be able to charge advertisers more money and that makes it worth it. No one is tuning into an NFL game because of Tom Brady, right? Like, broadcasters just don't move the needle. Yeah. Whether you're Greg Olsen, Tom Brady, Troy Aikman, whatever, it doesn't matter. You have to get him to go do other things. That's why you see him posting social media videos of the LFG award every week. You see him doing all these other things for Fox. So the way I explain it to people is that Tom Brady's an ambassador for Fox. He's not a broadcaster. And I think that makes it worth it. Whereas if you were just going to consider him as a broadcaster, that's a preposterous amount of money to pay a broadcaster.
I would agree with it. And I also enjoyed the experience of him being a broadcaster, not because of anything he said necessarily. And I agree with everybody that Greg Olsen is a better broadcaster. There's just something to the weight of that guy. I enjoyed, perhaps perversely, watching Patrick Mahomes melt down while Tom Brady was announcing the game. That's something I would not get from Greg Olsen. If Greg Olsen was announcing that game, I'm sure he would say trenchant things about it, and that would be helpful to the broadcast. But there was something to what a bizarre situation where Brady, at some level, he would never admit it, has to care about his status relative to Mahomes. And for now, the idea that Mahomes will be elevated above Tom Brady has been put on pause, at least for a few years, and he's announcing the game.
Oh,
and
he loved it. He loved it.
Oh, he had to. He felt giddy. It felt like giddiness was coming through the TV. That was just a delicious little snippet right there. And
he's also so much better in studio than he is on the broadcast. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen his stuff on Colin Cowherd's show. Like, when he sits down,
it's so good.
It's so good. He's amazing at it. When he just sits there and he's relaxed and he just talks about being a quarterback in the NFL and the challenges and all these other things, like, it's amazing. And I just don't really understand, like, sure, broadcasting is a different animal, but some of that should translate over, and maybe it will over time, and he'll get. I do think he got better from the beginning of the year to the end. Like, the reps obviously helped, and by the Super Bowl, like, he was more than a serviceable announcer. But it's just so difficult when you think about Greg Olsen, because there was only one person really in the world that could have taken Greg Olsen's job, and he decided that he wanted to be a broadcaster.
Yep, that's what happened. It wasn't Greg Olsen's fault. I think what's good about Tom Brady in a lot of these situations in studio, by the way, is his brutal honesty and harshness that almost cuts against his public image, that he will not mince words, which I also think is one of the advantages of Troy Aikman. He's so negative, Troy Aikman is, and that's what I love about him when he's just crushing a player on broadcast, because there's just not enough of that sometimes, especially from the perspective of the NBA world, where it feels as though I don't know. The agents run everything, so you can't talk bad about any player or even any GM. And when I'm watching the Mavericks play on ESPN, they're telling you about how maybe the trade will work out, the Luka trade. And I'm going, I don't. Okay,
that's a tough one to spin. Yeah, that's a tough one to spin. Well, now there's this theory that, and this is the topic for another day, but the theory that inside the NBA is somehow ruining the NBA because they're negative sometimes.
It's insane. It's so insane. It's just like this manifestation of LeBron James's insecurity that's been pushed into the ecosystem, which there's a layer of irony to it, or unacknowledged aspect of it as well, where LeBron is going, it's all negative. It's all negative. And I'm going, what about all your media proxies that are all over the media ecosystem talking about your greatness every day? You're the one who is overtly directing it to be positive, and you're telling me it's all negative. I feel gaslit, LeBron James. I gotta say, it's this irony where the more the players are getting coddled, the more they're saying it's never been worse. I thought Bill Simmons did a great job on his podcast detailing how harsh the coverage used to be of these players when things would go wrong. I actually thought Nick Wright had a good counter argument that the players would get crushed based on what happened in the postseason, but now there's more of a day-to-day referendum on who they are that makes them more insecure.
There is, but what's wrong with that? Everything else is so positive. I don't have any problem with that at all. Like, that's the world we live in today, where it goes from you take a full body of work to now it's every single thing that you do, but you can't always be positive about it, right? You have to be negative about it in some aspect, because in a lot of ways, that's the truth, right? Like, if LeBron failing when he first got to Miami, if you were just positive about that, saying, oh, he had to adapt to a new team, like, that would lose a huge chunk of his story, where he got there and they struggled and they lost the first time and they came back and won. Like, that redemption arc makes sports so much better, versus if you were to take the other side of that and say, it's okay, he lost, he did his best. Like, no one cares about that.
Yeah, they've removed the stakes of it. They try to build the plane out of the black box, as it were. They try to make it a situation where winning affords you immense glory and there's no tension or suspense to it. That's what I feel nervous about when I'm rooting for a player at some level. I'm feeling this sense of, if they fail, they're going to get crushed. And if they win, it's going to be a glory. And guess what? It's unfair, because it's a small sample size and a bunch of random things not in their control are going to determine whether it's glory or whether they're getting savage. But in a way, we almost can't have one without the other. We cannot have a situation where it's just going to be glory.
It's so funny you say that. It's so funny you say that, because when they were playing in the playoffs, Lamar, the Ravens and the Bills, I'm a Giants fan, so I didn't really care who necessarily won. I like the Bills. I like Josh Allen. But the whole time I was watching, I was thinking, I'm like, damn, they're going to kill Lamar Jackson if he loses this game. They're going to kill him. They're going to kill him. It's going to be his whole story. And I like Lamar Jackson. I think he's a great player. So I'm thinking to myself, like, I really don't want him to lose this game. And I never thought about it in that context. That's literally why I was so interested in the game, was because of the negative response that was going to happen if Lamar lost. And I found myself really rooting for him because I didn't want that to happen.
I felt that with LeBron. I wanted LeBron to win that first championship with Miami, and when he was melting down in that game 6, I'm feeling bad. I'm feeling, oh, this is going to be bad for him. But that's part of the juice. And I understand not wanting the bad or thinking that it's unfair. It comes back to that Mad Men, that's what the money's for line, but it's beyond the money. It's bigger than the money. It's just what the whole suspense and appeal and pull of it is, and trying to edit it out. And the way it's been edited out as part of the news breaking ecosystem is you're placating these players in order to get the information first, and placating these agents. Don't like it. Not a fan, but hey, that's maybe the theme of this particular podcast show. There are things happening that we're not always a fan of. We're just going to try to be as honest as we can be. What do you want to promote for the outro? What should we be checking out?
Just the newsletter. If you guys want to learn more about some of the stuff we talked about, ESPN MLB, ESPN Bet, all that kind of stuff, Huddle Up, read huddleup.com. You can find it there. I'm sure you'll tag me in the stuff, but we do it 3 days a week. So go sign up.
Great stuff, Joe. Thanks so much, man.